is Colin Conwell, presenting purely perceptual machines that robustly predict human visual arousal, valence, and aesthetics. Thank you.
All right, thanks so much. Have a look around the room. Do you like what you see? Whether it's an alien creature with Kinshinshima cuteness so overwhelming you worry you might actually explode by looking at it, a scene whose soul-shaking menace you cannot adequately describe, or a work desk so satisfyingly arranged you feel as if you've entered a celestial soul bond with Marie Kondo herself, seeing the world almost always means feeling the world. Sometimes so much, it seems as if the space between us and the world has disappeared entirely. What gives us this feeling, and where does it come from? Seeing with feeling is, in fancier parlance, generally called visually evoked affect. If you've ever described an image in terms of how moving it is, how positive or negative it is, you've described that image in terms of the visual affects it evokes in you. Dominant theories of visually evoked affect describe it as a complex interplay of three processes. First, the subjective perception of the immediate sensory environment. Second, some sort of physiological or bodily state change. And third, a cognitive interpretation of that change with respect to our percepts. That some combination of these processes is at play in our experience of seeing with feeling is a given, but the relative contributions of each to any given affect remains a matter of perpetual debate, and one that seems seemingly intractable to arbitrate empirically. This is, of course, where we bring in the machines, or more specifically, perceptual machines in the form of modern deep neural network algorithms. There are many things these machines are and many things that they are not. What these machines generally tend to be are highly trained specialist feed-forward representation learners designed to transform various digital inputs, like the pixels of an image, into one of several usually well-defined outputs, like the category label of this obscure dog breed known as the Finnish Spitzhound. What these machines very importantly are not, however, is affective, with states that correspond under any definition to those of a physiological body, and no capacity for the abstract symbol manipulations that we typically associate with higher order thought. What then, if anything, might these machine vision systems tell us about seeing with feeling? The fundamental premise of the work I'll be presenting today is that precisely because these machines are in many ways purely perceptual, they allow us to approximate what could be the unique contribution of perceptual computations to visually evoked affect, isolating those computations in empirically manipulable systems free from the influence of body and thought. To test this, our approach is to collect human ratings of affect for a series of naturalistic images and to see how much of the variance in those ratings we can explain with linear decoding from the responses of our purely perceptual machines. Our main human behavioral data comes from the OASIS dataset, a series of 900 images selected specifically to evoke the full possible range of arousal and valence ratings, and to which ratings of beauty were later added. Participants in the OASIS study were asked to rate the images they were shown on a scale of 1 to 7, based on one of 3 prompts. All counted, this data set leaves us with the group average ratings of arousal, valence, and beauty across hundreds of responses per image. It is these group average affect ratings that we take as the target of our deep neural network paradigm. The deep neural network models we test consist of 120 distinct models. Our selection of models include many kinds of architectures trained predominantly in the task of object categorization, as well as models with identical architectures trained on a variety of other computer vision tasks, including self-supervised models that learn meaningful representations without category labels. Our models also include a number of architecture-matched randomly initialized networks, a sort of control group that allows us to assess the predictivity of feed-forward hierarchical computation in the absence of learning. Crucially, none of these models received any explicit training on affect. To assess each model's ability to predict the group average affect ratings, we proceed layer by layer through the network, recording the responses of those layers to the images viewed by the human subjects, and reducing the dimensionality of those responses using sparse random projection where necessary. We then use our extracted responses as the predictors in a regularized linear regression fit to the group average affect ratings and employ a rigorous cross-validation procedure to ensure our models aren't simply overfitting the data we're interested in predicting. This leaves us with a predictive score of -100 to +100 for each layer of the network, with a score of +100 corresponding to a perfect correlation between the machine's predicted ratings and the actual ratings provided by the human subjects. We take the cross-validated max over the individual layer scores to produce a single accuracy per model. There's one final element we must consider before we consider these accuracies, namely the question of how accurate our models could be given the inevitable idiosyncrasies of human response. In this analysis, we calculate 2 measures of idiosyncrasy. To calculate what we call the mean -1 correlation, we iteratively remove one subject from the human subject pool and correlate that subject's responses with the average of the group remaining. This provides what is effectively a reference point for general agreement. We also calculate the split half reliability of our sample, repeatedly splitting the subject pool into random halves, then correlating the average ratings of one half with the average ratings of the other half. This provides a noise ceiling, an upper bound on how well we might expect a model to predict our data, given how well the data predicts itself. Without further ado, then, let's have a look at the results. On the y-axis of this plot is the score, the Pearson correlation between predicted and actual ratings of the given affect. The gray bars at the top of the plot are the remarkably high split half reliability noise ceilings. The data in black are the mean -1 correlations of the human subject pool. The larger the spread of these points, the larger the variability in individual responses. The data in purple are the scores of the object recognition trained category supervised models. The data in red are the scores of the self-supervised models trained without category labels. And the data in yellow are the scores of the untrained models. Considered in the aggregate, the main takeaway here is that purely perceptual machines are remarkably accurate in predicting human affect, with the average pre-trained models explaining 52 to 57% of the explainable variance in ratings, and the best models explaining up to 76% of the explainable variance in ratings. The far lower predictive accuracies of untrained models suggest this is not simply a function of hierarchical computation, but of learning. The parity of self-supervised and category supervised models suggests this learning can be entirely domain general, with no reference whatsoever to symbolic or affective targets. Of course, you may be wondering, with such high levels of accuracy, maybe the models are picking up on something far less interesting than full-blown affect. Perhaps, for example, there are low-level confounds in the image that make the task of prediction easier than it seems. Images that are arousing, for example, may just be those images with greater quantities of the color red. If something like this were true, it would mean that shallower, lower-level features in the models are the features most predictive of affect, since these are the features that are most sensitive to low-level image properties like color, saturation, and contrast. This plot shows definitively that this is not the case. On the x-axis of this plot is the relative depth of a given slice of model layers, with the shallower layers of the model towards the left and the deeper layers of the model towards the right. On the y-axis is the score we obtain from a given slice of layers, and each point is an individual model. The takeaway here is simple. It is the deepest, most abstract features in the networks that are most predictive of affect. Simpler features in the earlier layers almost uniformly perform worse. So far in our analysis, we've only considered group average affect ratings. Another question we might ask naturally is how predictive our models are of individual subjects. To answer this, we fit the best performing layers from each model to the ratings of individual subjects. In this plot, each point is the predictive accuracy we obtain for a given subject, either from the average model or the best model. This plot shows that the average model's predicted responses correlate around 48% with the average subject's actual responses. For the best model in our survey, this correlation is around closer to 60%. Curiously, our ability to predict individual subjects is directly a function of how well that individual subject's responses correlate with the group average, their mean -1 correlation. These plots show that the more an individual subject's responses accord with the group average, the better able we are to predict that subject's ratings using our purely perceptual models. This means one of two things. In the absence of a better measure of how consistent individuals are in their ratings of affect over time, it may mean that the subjects our models predict poorly are just unreliable, and models cannot reasonably be expected to estimate unreliable data. However, if those subjects our models predict poorly are in fact consistent, it may mean we've stumbled serendipitously on what could only be called automated hipster detection. This would mean that when purely perceptual models fail to predict a given subject's response, it may be because these models or the perceptions they mimic are simply too mainstream to account for the very cognitive operation is actively required by going against the grain. So where does all this leave us? What, if anything, can machine vision models tell us about seeing with feeling? The predictive accuracy of our purely perceptual models tells us that the vast majority of explainable variance in human ratings of affect may actually be a direct function of domain general representational learning over natural image statistics. Without physiological flux, without interoception, without self-concept, without any semblance of symbolic thought, our machine vision model tells us that the bulk of information relevant to our visually evoked affect may be inherent to feed-forward perception, and that only the most minimal of downstream readout systems, a single linear perceptron's worth of reweighting, may be necessary to churn our perceptions into affective experience. We can perhaps better situate this takeaway by making our central question a bit more focused, asking more specifically, what, if anything, can our machine vision models tell us about the experience of beauty? Dominant theories of aesthetics tend to situate the source of beauty at one of two ends of a spectrum. At one end of the spectrum is the input, the material substrate, the image itself. Beauty in this formulation is at least partially a direct, measurable property of the world that humans happen to be sensitive to and find pleasing. At the other end of the spectrum, of course, is ideation, our thoughts, mental manipulations, and what OG aesthetics bad boy Immanuel Kant calls our faculty of judgment. Beauty in this formulation is predicated on the abstract computations of cognition. In other words, beauty requires thought. Right smack dab in the middle of this spectrum, of course, is what we would most parsimoniously call perception, a series of computations directly grounded in sensory inputs, but shaped by experience. In this formulation, beauty exists not in any one image, but in representations shaped by many images over a lifetime of visual experience. This means, perhaps, that what beauty really requires is learning. That machine vision models approximating this learning do so well in predicting aesthetic ratings suggests that the experience of beauty may in large part be a direct reflection of having distilled meaning from sensory chaos, something vision science knows to happen long before conscious deliberative thought, and often in a way that is fundamentally ineffable. The relevance of perceptual machines to visually evoked affect is an open invitation for vision science to help develop a more computationally principled, mechanistic, image computable understanding of what it means to see with feeling. And doing so, I bet, would feel real good. Thank you, and I'm happy to take your questions.
I wonder if you try to use these networks to generate new images and then show them to people, would they actually find them beautiful or, you know?
Yeah, so we're actively in the process right now of kind of exploring whether or not we can use the learned representations or the reweighting functions of our linear models to do something like gradient ascent to make images that are more aesthetic along some latent space vector that corresponds to whatever it is our models are picking up on, but that's an active area of progress. So far, the gradient ascent methods that we've used seem really only to do things like increase contrast, but I think we need to turn towards more generative models to get something that's, you know, more applicable.
Hi, Colin.
Hello.
A little short. Okay. So I'm wondering what learning, like at the end, when you say beauty requires learning, there's many ways to interpret what it means.
Mhm.
One way is literally meaning like learning, cognitive learning when you grow up, you learn visual experience. The other way is you can think of it as a machine learning, which can actually happen like equivalent to humans' evolution history. Like, what's your thoughts on that?
Say that last sentence one more
Yeah,
time.
so like in machine learning, the way that it shapes the inductive biases in the machine could come from like similarly in human, like lifetime learning or the evolution process. Like,
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is totally agnostic to which particular kind of learning gives you the experience that is aesthetics. I think that could either come from ecologically relevant targets that are developed over many phylogenetic lifetimes. So, you know, what is beautiful to us is what tends to be salient to our survival. I think that's a perfectly viable hypothesis. And so visual experience will naturally manifest and show that across many different examples and many different lifetimes. I also think, though, that there's a cultural learning signal in here as well. So it's kind of, the learning is necessarily agnostic. I also think it's polysemous with beauty requires learning not only to experience beauty, but then the function of beauty is also similarly to learn. It serves as like an affective target to kind of facilitate downstream learning. So I think it's kind of applies equally across all those categories.
great, I agree with you.
We can have one final question.
Hello. And do you analyze the images which were predicted, like the best for the model and the worst images? Just because I would suspect that there are categories like cats, which could, like easily you predict like affection for that.
Yeah, so we actually, I do have some data. We've broken down the actual categories of the OASIS data set into some of the image categories that it came with. By large, the model is doing best at predicting landscapes. For things like animals, the model is a bit worse. It's all pretty high in terms of its predictive accuracies, but there definitely are some idiosyncrasies in terms of the image category that we're trying to predict. Fortunately, I didn't have time to cover that today.
Yeah, it's interesting to analyze within the category or manipulate the image, which as a, for example, classification probability will be the same for the object, but as a affection, it's different for the people. And to see how the neural network, how your linear decoder could do it.
Yeah,
I would
totally.
suspect it will not do it, because I think that the most part is just the object recognition thing. That some objects just have a good feeling. And
Yeah, so that
like
last,
mountains, lakes, I don't know, like something like this.
yeah, I think that last point brings up a very interesting potential future direction, which is how much of this can be explained with semantic labels. Even though we have the self-supervised models, which are learning without any explicitly semantic targets, they're developing covariances with semantic labels that it might, reduce down to something like dog is the most applicable of the categories. And anytime there's a dog in the image, it's beautiful. We do have some preliminary work suggesting that language models, which are given captions of these images, actually don't give you representations that are in any way significant or sufficient enough to produce the same levels of ratings as the images themselves, but that's an ongoing area of development.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Colin.
No problem.
And thank you very much, everyone, for coming to the Cortical Organization session and to our 7 speakers. Thank you all.